Throughout his poetry, the war poet Wilfred Owen utilizes a vast range of linguistic and conceptual tools to convey his frustration at the battle. Such poems, like most of his work, were published between August 1917 and September in 1918, while fighting in World War I. Owen is renowned for his wrenching depictions of wartime hardship, where in each poem he draws on various viewpoints. He described the harsh daily life of a company of soldiers in Dulce, the decorum est, focused on a tale of one soldier agonizing demise, and addresses the pain left behind by this occurrence. The poem, Anthem for the Doomed Out, nevertheless laments the destruction of youthful life in combat, and depicts the tactile horrors of fighting. Owen's remarkable usage of rhetorical and symbolic tools, such as symbolism and imagery, demonstrates the realities of battle, by demonstrating the horrific experiences that soldiers are witnessing in the middle of combat based on his deep and traumatic personal experience, and the lasting effect that it ultimately has on them. Owen held an optimistic perception of the conflict and was influenced by the patriotism of the war effort. His poems, including Dulce et decorum est and Anthem for the Doomed Out, bring to life the physical and emotional pain of war from the viewpoint of his deep personal experience on the front line. His main goal was to tell the truth about what he called war pity. This is seen by the realism of lines, where he begins the poem with a summary of the marching soldiers. His mind is based on the grimness and misery of the condition that seems to have ate people easily, zapping them out of childhood. In the first paragraph, the speaker compares the soldiers to old beggars, bent under their burdens. In line 2, he contrasts their mourning to that of hags, a derogatory term for the sick, and highlights their physical weariness as they struggle through the mud. Consequently, Owen's primary inspiration for these poems is his painful experience in the war that contributed to the hatred seen throughout the poems depicted. It is clear in both poems that the poet primarily expresses the secret reality of war, obscured by church bells, prayers, and chores. Anthem of Doomed Out is a poem concerning World War I, which is believed to have triggered 17 million deaths worldwide. Published by World War I combatant Wilfred Owen while suffering from a fighting wound, the poem gives a simple declaration: war is a hellish and pointless waste of human existence. From the beginning to the end, the poem foregrounds the wastefulness of war, in which the reader gets a sense of how war hollows civilization, particularly in its constant degradation of young people. Men, the poem suggests, are disposable. Their deaths are only part of the price of war. Owen shows this in his first line of the poem, where he compares men to a carol. That is expressed as a gesture in which he uses the carol to symbolize certain poor youth who are driven into battle due to the religious or political views they experience. In addition, Owen uses a metaphor to compare these men with farmed animals, brought into life for their slaughter only to grow big. In fact, the poem makes no effort to glorify battle, or to portray such people as brave or honorable, as it makes the argument that the sheer nature of the fight makes such characteristics virtually meaningless. Accordingly, the poem is full of the everyday challenges of war, instead of filling it with descriptions of courage. Weapons are crashing overhead, the rapid firing of rifles, and wailing bullets. The later choice image is crucial in showing Owen's point. All these are portrayed as hellish and frightening, where the guns fire in monstrous anger, and the shells scream like shrill, demented joys. In this case, Owen is trying to prove the terrifying side of the war, with its consequences. The poem points out that these men, fed to the warlike nameless bovine livestock, will never come home anyway. The real national anthem is no longer important. The buggles will cry out, sad shires for them. Shires applies to Britain's different parts, but the message would remain unanswered forever. Owen uses imagery in this stanza to manifest the impact of war on these innocent lives, who struggle every day because of the religious or political beliefs they follow. As stated, the speaker is exhibiting these theories based on his terrible personal experience in the war, which led to his anger and hatred exhibited towards war. Likewise, the poem Dulce et decorum est, in particular, the horrors of that conflict are depicted graphically and vividly, through implicitly speaking about all war's catastrophe, while concentrating on the pain of war. Owen is straightforward in his abstract. His description of these horrors is disturbing in its specificity, and Owen's manner of making it plain that this fear permeates all aspects of combat. The banal everyday life of a soldier is awful. The horrific reality of fighting is endless torture, and even surviving a fight after watching others struggle causes a lifetime of relentless suffering. The manner in which Owen utilizes words to bring readers beyond a soldier's perceptions enables them to appreciate the horrible reality in all these awful war aspects. As reported, based on his painful past, his traumatic language is exhibited in both poems to thoroughly show his hate and rage against battle. The poem thrusts the reader through the relentless drudgery and agony of military existence in the first stanza of Dulce et decorum est, as the speaker's division marches back from the front lines to an undescribed, disinterested place. This isn't an image of people inspired by ambition or pleased by battle. Instead, they're miserable, coughing like hags, cursing with sore feet as they trudge through sludge. We're marching asleep, meaning the soldiers are like a living skeleton. The fear and cruelty of fighting deaden them, while the speaker makes it clear that the life of a soldier is painful and demoralizing. In the second stanza, which switches from reflecting the united we of a battalion to a single dying individual, he shows that death in combat is horrible, too, barbarous, agonizing, and pointless. Within the first two lines of the second stanza, the speaker explains the terror and dumb anger of facing a gas attack, a feature of the term War I fight that had never been utilized to such a horrible degree before that conflict, with the movement from the first yell of shoot to the rapid echo of the yell gas, interrupted by the fumbling of all citizens with clumsy helmets. Since the third stanza is written in the present tense, it indicates that such visions never fade. In both poems, the reader is eventually told not to romanticize battle. While both poems are lyrical and beautiful, their power comes from the manner in which they bring to life the horrors of war. War is held to the light and exposed as futile, horrible, and tragic. However, there are several variations between the viewpoints given on the war struggles of both poems. The critical distinction is based on the memorials carried out after the death of the troops, where in the Anthem for the Doomed Out, the memorials are portrayed as regulating variables that drive young people into battle. On the other side, in Dulce, decorum, est, it is seen that rather than seeing their coffins strewn with flags, they are best remembered by the grief-stricken faces of their loved ones, and that memorials, kindness, and gratitude can be utilized as fitting memorials. Dulce, decorum, est provides an entirely brutal, bleak, and gloomy view of the combat in its first three stanzas, especially of World War I. The fourth and last stanza is a turning point, whereas the first stanza centered on the we of the army, the second centered on the he of the suffering soldier, and the third on the I of the traumatized writer. The fourth stanza focused on the you of the reader. In this stanza, the author directly addresses the audience, attempting to get them to understand the brutal essence of battle. This is an attempt to counter what the speaker describes as a false reality, the common belief that fighting and dying in battle is essential and full of glory, expressed by the poet Horace in the Latin lines, "It's sweet and pleasant to die for one country." Throughout this view, Owen wrote the poem with the hope that by stressing the juxtaposition of a sanitized image of glorious death, as depicted by Horace, and the bleak, terrible truth of an actual battle, maybe the poem's audience will change its perspective against fighting and joyfully avoid sending young men, the mere children, to death with glory. Owen thus indicates in this stanza that love, compassion, and appreciation are fitting memorials for those soldiers who placed their lives on the line for their country. On the other hand, Anthem for Doomed Out claims that the repercussions of a conflict like the World War I make, for example, the normal tributes to the dead, bells are ringing, joint meditation, chorus singing, coffin draping with the national flag, almost meaningless. Nevertheless, even with these rituals, most people who die in this war will never be honored. There are so many fallen soldiers. The poem shows that their usual traditions are inadequate and claims more suitable for such an awful conflict in favor of alternative forms of remembrance. The ceremonies mentioned, the ringing bells, worship services, choral chants, are seen as mockeries that fail to do justice. These images are so far from the over realities of the battle that they are insulting the men they are meant to honor. Furthermore, church and government are huge parts of why those citizens first went to death. They needed the military to defend their country and their Christian values. The irony often has to do with how reasonably safe such supposedly ceremonies take place, while the troops witness the horrors of battle. In fact, the real weapons of war are the only fitting passing bells, horizons, and chores that can make a true homage to the war. They contest the reality of combat even though they are the facts of war. Furthermore, there is a different extent of hatred and anger demonstrated by the speaker in both poems. The poem Anthem for the Doomed Out was published in 1917, which is at the time when World War I was occurring. Hence, Owen shows more hatred towards the war due to his country facing a battle at the time when this poem was published. However, Dulce et decorum est was released after the war had ended, 1920, when the situation became more stable. Therefore, the poet's anger and hatred were exhibited to a lower extent. In conclusion, both poems condemn the usual ceremonial ways of homage used to honor those who died in battle. Furthermore, both poems criticize the ancient systems and political or religious frameworks that have for time immemorial brought young people to their deaths based on fairly magnificent stories. Owen rams more strange syllables in the poem into the first two lines that belong to the iambic parameter to create an overburdened and tense mood, which represents the roughness of the scene he's portraying. The poems need the listener to confront the reality and no longer be associated with the old myth, yet although they do, it seems to realize sadly that nothing is going to improve, as nothing has ever.